Thanks for being here today, and thanks to my friends at Occupational for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk, I guess I'm going to start off this occupational cancer section and then turn it over to Thomas about halfway through. There's no clock in here, so I'm going to, if I look at my phone, it's just to be able to tell the time. I don't have a watch. Most people here, I think, kind of taking a look around, I see a lot of familiar faces, but in case you don't know, the Occupational Cancer Research Center was started as one of the Centers for Research Expertise, along with several others with funding from the WSIB, but unlike the others, we're actually co-funded by the Canadian Cancer Society and Cancer Care Ontario. So we have a little bit different of a funding model, and of course it's transitioned over now from the WSIB over to the Ministry of Labor. Our research program is actually kind of three-pronged. We have studies that focus in on causes of cancer, so kind of traditional epidemiologic studies, but we also do work in the area of surveillance of both occupational cancer and occupational carcinogens, and some of that we do in collaboration with our friends at Occupational, and we also do some prevention-related work and even some intervention studies. One of which you'll probably hear about in a little bit from Thomas, who we collaborate with on a project that he's leading. In the area of cancer, because of the long period of time between when people are exposed and when they develop cancer, the area of kind of classification of carcinogens is a very, very important one for us. It certainly helps to propel regulation and a number of other things. And the primary agency for classification of carcinogens internationally is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Canada does not have an independent classification of carcinogens. Only a few countries like the United States do. We have, maybe Health Canada will say that a chemical is toxic, but not specifically whether it's carcinogenic. So things like IARC actually propel kind of labeling things as carcinogenic on material safety data sheets, and then in impact other forms of regulation. IARC has reviewed about 1,000 different things over time. And although it is sometimes portrayed as being, radical by people who don't like it, in fact, only about 10% of those things are actually classified as kind of confirmed Group 1 human carcinogens. So it's actually not that radical of a program. In fact, it's pretty restrained. Another 74 are classified as possible or probable carcinogens. And then about 300 as possible carcinogens, mostly ones that are confirmed animal carcinogens. The neutral category for IARC, for those of you who are ever looking at it, is actually Group 3, which is inadequate evidence. And that's actually considered neutral because in order to get referred to IARC, there's always a reason for suspicion. There is some kind of something about a particular chemical, either a positive animal study, some positive human studies, some similarity to other carcinogenic agents. So really benign stuff is never referred to IARC, and if there isn't enough data to classify it up, then that really is the neutral category that basically says we have an adequate evidence at this point to say one way or the other. Some people have said Group 4 is. In fact, Group 4 is not. It's very, very hard to get into Group 4. It means we had to come up, even though we were suspicious that it caused cancer, and have such overwhelming evidence that it doesn't, that it will go down. So Group 4 is almost never used. It's only been used once, and I don't even understand that one particularly. I don't need to spend any time on this. I think I've seen several versions of the hierarchy of controls already this morning. This is NIOSH's color version. But certainly in the area of cancer, we want to be really kind of operating at the higher level of the hierarchy of controls in terms of elimination and substitution whenever possible, engineering controls if not, and then work our way down. Unlike NIOSH, I added early recognition and screening, given that a lot of these carcinogens have been around for a long time, and primary prevention will only impact future rates of cancer. The classification of carcinogens really does, I think, propel things in a lot of areas here. There are very few carcinogens that have actually been eliminated worldwide. Certainly many countries have banned asbestos. We're not one of them. The United States isn't one of them. There's some key ones that are not, but most European countries have. Hopefully Canada joins that camp in the near future. There are efforts underway. But certainly it does propel substitution, and because of the labeling, it does really kind of, at least for some chemicals, push for some substitution. And then it certainly is an impetus for stronger regulations. Now, about in 2008 and 2009, that's the years they were held, IARC held 6 meetings to basically re-review all the known carcinogens. This was criticized a bit at the time because it basically represented a pause in the review of new carcinogens. But the idea was basically to reconfirm the existing carcinogens. Very few were added or changed at that point. I think leather dust was added, is the only one that I know of. But mostly it was a confirmation of what causes cancer, at least in group 1, and the mechanisms by which those are caused, as well as the cancer sites. And I think it's the cancer sites that particularly are useful in terms of areas like compensation. But I think the whole exercise kind of was a bit useful, and even though it was criticized at the time, the fact is that I can see a noticeable change in how IARC evaluates carcinogens since that time. There is much more of an emphasis on identifying cancer sites, but there's also much more of the use of mechanistic evidence, that is, experimental evidence to say that a chemical or a physical agent or whatever operates in a certain manner that increases the risk of cancer, and even in the absence of having human studies or animal studies, that is often used to upgrade carcinogens at least by one level. So it has made a difference. But in the period since that time, in fact, IARC holds about 3 meetings a year, generally I believe in February, March, and then one later in the spring, and then another one around October. So it's had about 15 meetings since that time, and 10 of those meetings have been significant for occupational carcinogens, and more than that if we consider environmental carcinogens. So it's been a very active period of change. And where it is particularly important is that a lot of things have been upgraded. Some things new have been evaluated, but a number of things have been upgraded. And one of the key ones in terms of impacting a lot of people is diesel engine exhaust. That is now upgraded to a definite human carcinogen for lung cancer, and then also as a possible cause of bladder cancer. It was an interesting meeting, and I'm going to basically, in the next few minutes, just talk a bit about some of the key decisions that have happened over the last 5 years. Not all of them, because that would take a full hour. But this is a fairly interesting one in that it was a very, very clear statement on diesel engine exhaust, not so much on gasoline engine exhaust, and it's mostly because of the absence of occupational evidence for gasoline exhaust. We have populations that in workplaces that specifically have high levels of exposure to diesel, but usually people are exposed to gasoline exhaust as a mixture of exhaust from different types of vehicles, so it's hard to discern those 2 different ones. There was a focus on trying to look at the different components of diesel exhaust, and they looked at 11 different components, almost all of which are confirmed animal carcinogens. But the important thing here was that they looked at it in terms of a complex mixture and classified that as a carcinogen. Unfortunately, our regulations have not kept up, and our regulations do not reflect the current evidence on the carcinogenicity of diesel engine exhaust, or the other health effects for that matter. Some other things that happened in the last 5 years was an upgrading of trichloroethylene to being a group 1 human carcinogen for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and liver cancer. and the upgrading of tetrachloroethylene to be a probable human carcinogen, as well as dichloromethane. Now, the use of many of these chlorinated solvents has been decreasing in recent years because of concern for the ozone. Global warming is driving it, not human health, or at least not worker health. Still, there is still a lot of use of these chemicals in workplaces, and so I think these are important ones. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which have not been used as a new chemical in a while, but still there are people exposed to them through old transformers or other contaminated equipment, were also classified as a cause of malignant melanoma. These are very, very toxic, it's a very, very toxic set of chemicals, actually, polychlorinated biphenyls, and so this is not at all a surprise. A new area that IARC has gone into is looking at synthetic fibers and tubules. That's a very important one. There's a lot more nano fibers, nanotubes being out there. Some of those are silicon carbide, but then stuff in the nano range, you can see kind of a picture down here, is also more and more coming into use. These are things that look very much like asbestos in terms of the nanofibers, and are very, very concerning for that purpose. Silicon carbide fibers produced by the Atchison process, which may sound obscure, but that's how the majority of silicon carbide fibers were produced for a number of years, have been classified as a cause of lung cancer. And part of that is, and one of the reasons that it's separated out is because there's exposure to crystalline silica in the form of cristobalite in this process, and they couldn't just separate out the two. But there's actually a feeling that silicon whiskers overall should be classified as probably carcinogenic. And then multi-walled carbon nanotubes, a particular type, 7. I don't know how one arrives at 7 as a type, but it is a kind of a commonly used type, or has been, was classified as possibly human carcinogen because of its impact on animal studies causing mesothelioma. So what we see here is a lot of things that are in animal studies. These things are looking like asbestos in many different ways. And so it was, I think, a very good move that IARC is actually moving forward in these things. And these are substances that have worried us for quite some time. As part of that decision, they also classify fluoroedenite as another confirmed lung carcinogen. And this may sound obscure to folks. Fluoroedenite is only mined in a couple places that I know, in Italy, around Mount Etna, where a lot of the studies have been done, and then in one area of Japan. But it is important in that it joins erionite as another form of mineral that is very, very similar to asbestos. Asbestos is, as anybody who's ever heard me speak, I try to stress, it's a commercial term, it's not a mineralogic term. And so there are a number of minerals out there that are not regulated, even though they're very, very similar, looking to asbestos in terms of their mineral content and their shape and form and things like that. They're perhaps less common, but they're certainly very concerning. And this makes a big difference when it comes to things like Libby, Montana, where the actual fibers in the contaminating the Libby, the vermiculite from Libby are a mixture of different types of asbestos-like minerals, only 5% of which would be considered asbestos. So 95% of those fibers we're not regulating at all, because they're not considered to be asbestos. And for people who've read any of the papers on this, this is what's called the Libby amphibole is really a very terrible exposure in terms of causing very, very fast progressing asbestosis and a very potent cause of cancer as well. So this is an important decision in that matter. It may move some regulatory agencies to maybe rethink how they define asbestos. At least I hope so. Ooh, I didn't realize this was actually animated. Here, let me just catch up. I was very happy to see the presentation just before this on farm workers. But one of the areas where we're, I think, beginning to move forward again after a fairly long pause is on the classification of pesticides as carcinogenic. Certainly, for a long time, IARC has considered pesticide applicators as a group increased risk for cancer, but these specific pesticides have been very hard to classify, and it's been many decades since they've revisited this issue. This spring and summer, a number of decisions came out of IARC, some of which got in the newspaper. One of which got a lot of press was glyphosate being caused a probable cause of cancer. I'll say that for most of these pesticides here, they're with one or two exceptions, these are confirmed animal carcinogens, but they've all been associated with, for the most part, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in various studies. But it's hard to kind of separate out the effects of these different pesticides. Glyphosate was particularly important because it's, I believe, the largest production pesticide in the world. And in fact, we're genetically modifying plants to be resistant to things like glyphosate, so you can use even more of it. Yet it has a lot of toxicity in its own right. So this certainly upset Monsanto to a large extent and has caused a lot of flack for IARC. But you'll see here that malathion, which is not an uncommon pesticide either, is also in that category, as well as diazinon, parathion, and tetrachlorovinifos are wrongly classified as possible human carcinogens. Lindane was moved up to a definite human carcinogen. We don't use it for head lice anymore in Canada that I'm aware of, but that has been used for a long time. It's always known to be a probable carcinogen and is very toxic. It's a matter of balancing risks. But in this case, I think it's being moved out now. DDT and was classified as a probable, and then 2,4-D was just made a possible carcinogen. 2,4-D being one of the other extremely high volume pesticides in the world. So these are fairly significant decisions, and I hope will propel some changes around the treatment of pesticides. So I, with the help of Kate Jardine, who's over here and helping and here attending this meeting, we kind of went through the IARC list to see, well, where do we stand on workplace carcinogens based upon IARC? I often say that there's about 60 probable and definite workplace carcinogens, but there's been a number of things upgraded here. And what we've divided them into three groups. One is basically things that we know that there's a lot of current use as a chemical or physical agent. Other things where it's an exposure circumstance like welding or painting that are associated with an increased risk. And some of them are things that we've actually are either very rare or historic exposures here in Canada. Now what you would hope for is that when something gets classified as a definite workplace carcinogen, that it would move from the top category to the third category, that we would actually say, okay, we know that this causes cancer, we should be moving to making this not a common exposure in Canada. But that's definitely not the case for many different types of chemicals. These are estimates from the CAREX project just for Ontario. Certainly you'll see, time check here, okay. Solar radiation is certainly the top. We can't do a lot about that in terms of the potential for exposure, but we can certainly take more protective measures, and I'm sure you're going to hear about that in a bit. But lots of people exposed to diesel engine exhaust, benzene, silica, other types of combustion products, wood dust, artificial UV ionizing radiation, formaldehyde, asbestos, and so on. You don't see radon on here, but it would certainly be up in this list of relatively common ones. We're just coming out with our estimate for the numbers of people exposed. now. And you'll see antineoplastic drugs, which I didn't include in the occupational carcinogens previously, because the primary exposure to that is probably to patients in terms of maybe levels of exposure. The thing is that a patient gets the benefits of those drugs, and healthcare workers only get the harmful effects of those drugs. I'm just going to say a few things about asbestos because we're hoping that things are going to heat up to make a push for another ban of asbestos here in Canada. This is our kind of numbers of mesotheliomas in Ontario. We used a 3-year rolling average because things do jump around from year to year. What you see here is that we're up around 180 new cases per year just here in Ontario, and about 500 or so nationwide. We have not, from everything that I've seen, hit a plateau yet. They say they've hit that in the United States. I don't see the evidence here in Canada. And for every one of these mesotheliomas, there are many other cases of lung cancer and other forms of cancer. So this is really just a very visible peak of the, or tip of the iceberg. And it certainly doesn't hit people randomly. This is just our current mapping of the occurrence of mesothelioma around the province. Certainly Lambton County still comes out very high, but you see that there's a number of other, this is by public health unit within the province, a number of other areas that are higher than the average, which is driven by Toronto, the rates in Toronto. But certainly you see it in eastern and northern Ontario, or certainly northwestern Ontario, and that as well around areas like Hamilton. Now, compensation has also been on the rise. And I've focused this here on asbestos. Does this little arrow show? I guess it does. Okay, so this top line is, as I told you, things jump around from year to year. This top line represents compensated cases of mesothelioma, kind of the last year that we did this for. And this is published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in the open version a few years back. But we're reaching maybe up around 90. And there's about 180 mesotheliomas per year in the province. Now, some of those will be environmental exposure to asbestos, but the great majority are going to be occupational exposure to asbestos. For every case of mesothelioma, at least in studies of asbestos-exposed workers, we expect about 2.5 cases of lung cancer to occur, and yet we compensate less lung cancers than we do mesothelioma here in Ontario. But I'll say that Ontario is better than probably any province in Canada. It may be that there's another province that's better, but I don't know of it. Some of them actually compensate very little. Still, we should be compensating many more than this. But you see here that the other forms of cancer here are, or the other kinds of cancers, occupational cancers, are really many fewer, despite the fact that I think I kind of gave you an idea that we've got a lot of common workplace carcinogens here in Ontario. And recently we started a project to look and try to estimate really what's the full number of cancers that are associated with workplace exposures here in Canada, and we're developing provincial estimates as well as our national estimates, and looking at the full range of different carcinogens. We're looking at 44 different ones that are relatively common in Canada, and their impact on a lot of different cancer sites. And then with the assistance of Emil Tampa, we're looking also at the economic costs of that from the IWH. But this is really a national project with a lot of different partners, funded by the Canadian Cancer Society. And this is actually my last slide to say, well, this is just for 4 different carcinogens, what we think the annual impact of exposure to workplace carcinogens here is, based upon our current knowledge of historical exposures and the results of studies that have tried to look at people who are exposed. So these are estimates, but still you see that Non-melanoma skin cancer certainly generates the single largest numbers of cases. But lung cancer, which is still most often fatal, these are large numbers. These percentages here are the percentages of all lung cancers in the province. And so if you add up simply the estimates for asbestos, silica, and diesel, you would end up being about 15% of all lung cancers in the province. And those probably overlap to a bit of an extent. Certainly the people in construction or mining that might have multiples of those. But still, this is a lot of cancers, and it gives you the idea that we're really only capturing a small proportion of all the cancer that's out there through our compensation system. But the purpose of this project is more to really kind of propel primary prevention efforts and try to move us from allowing continued exposure to many of these workplace carcinogens. And oops, I was trying to end. There we go. So thank you very much for your attention. I can turn it over to Thomas. Thanks.